Welcome to How to Vibe Code a Custom Website with Cursor, Next.js, Git, GitHub, and Vercel, powered by Predev. Enjoy!
Here we are in a brand new, fresh Cursor project with nothing inside of it. And over the next few scenes, we're going to be building out a website using vibe coding techniques. The first thing that we're going to take a look at before we jump into vibe coding is this thing called Cursor Rules. Cursor Rules probably sounds a little bit fancy, but it's simple. All that it is a way of flavoring the Cursor code generating agent to better or more likely produce the type of code that we're aiming for. Let me give you a demonstration. So if we come over to this site right here, cursor.directory, and then come over to the rules section, here we can find a bunch of example cursor rule files. And on the left here, each cursor rule file is categorized based on the type of development it's related to. So let's say, for example, that our goal was to build maybe a Chrome extension. So what we could do is copy this cursor rule file into our cursor project, and Cursor's internal system would detect that we added this and incorporate all of these guidelines that are theoretically related to producing higher quality Chrome extensions. Because we're building a website, let's add a cursor rule related to Next.js. Next.js is one of the most popular website development or web application development frameworks on the market right now. I read through each of these example cursor rule files, and the one that I liked the most, aka the one that is most aligned to what I'm trying to accomplish, is this one. The way that we add this into our project is at the root, we have to add a folder called .cursor. And then within this .cursor folder, we have to add another folder called rules. And then within this rules folder, we add a file that can be called whatever we want. I'll call it my custom rules. And the extension for this file will be .mdc. And then we paste in the cursor rules that we want to use. Save. Now we're good to go. By the way, there's nothing special about this cursor rules file. All it is natural language in Markdown format. Markdown is a specific way of formatting text in a document. Let's move on. Alrighty, so let's get to some vibe coding. And let's pop open the chat panel, Command I. And what we're going to be doing is building a website, but not just any website. We are going to be rebuilding the Command Labs company website. What I've generally seen in my experience be most effective is you want to start with a solid foundation or boilerplate, and then incrementally vibe code your way to your final destination. So the way that we incorporate the cursor rules into the prompt is like so. We type the @ symbol, and then this allows us to handpick pieces of context for addition into the prompt. We can configure the cursor rules to be included into every prompt by specifying this always option. But anyhow, we'll go with this approach for now. So we'll select the cursor rules that we outlined and say, please build the boilerplate for an incredible web app that will eventually act as the website for a AI automation agency called Command Labs. Pause after creating the solid boilerplate. Now let's see what happens. Okay, so it's saying we're going to build a project using the Create Next App CLI. Let's see what happens. And it ran into an error because there's an existing folder in this project. This CLI tool expects an empty folder. but there's a hack where it'll create a project in a subfolder and then move all the files back into the current folder. That's what's happening here. And here is a little menu that we have to provide some answers to the CLI through. It's now generating the project folder. I'm going to skip this because it's going to install a bunch of packages. And I'll say move the Next.js app into the current folder. I want everything here, not nested down one folder level. Perfect. Now it's installing all of those packages where I want them. Okay, moment of truth. Let's say run the application. Okay, well, we have some sort of starting point. So let's save this and then continue. Let's lock this stuff in by making a git commit. So if this seems foreign, all we're doing here is saving the current snapshot of our project. And in Git lingo, a snapshot is a commit. Now that we have that saved, beautiful. Let's continue on and make this look a little bit more impressive. So the first thing I'll do is ask the agent to make this mobile responsive. So we have an error here. I'm going to copy it. All right, that's looking a little bit better, but this is not centered for some reason. Let's add a screenshot of the landing page and say, please center the content. It is skewed left. There we go. Make the nav a mobile responsive drawer. And let's wrap this up because I think you get the point. The days of having to code everything yourself, those days are over. Sometimes that will be the right approach because the AI sometimes is not as efficient as you would think or hope. And it definitely helps to have coding skills. But anyhow, let's say scaffold out dummy content for the about services, case studies, and contact pages. I think the last thing we'll do is update the color palette. Hopefully this works. All right. It could be better, but in the name of respecting time, I'll leave it there. I definitely will be tweaking this some more, but for now, I'm pretty happy where this is at. So let's take another snapshot of the application, and we can also do this via this pane right here. And here's a fun little trick. You can click this button to have AI generate a commit message for you. And let's take that snapshot. Bingo. Perfect. We have been storing these Git snapshots or commits of our application on our computer. But let's say that we wanted to store a copy of them somewhere in the cloud for backup purposes. Or let's say that we wanted to store a copy of them so that we could collaborate on building up this code base with other team members. That is where hosted Git platforms come into the picture. There are many options and platforms that we could choose for our hosted Git provider, but for now, we're going to go with GitHub. Let's now walk through how to connect our machine or computer, or authenticate rather, our machine or our computer with GitHub. This is the website that I usually follow along with. if I have trouble remembering these exact commands. I'm going to link this in the description of this video. You pretty much just have to walk down this list of instructions. And if this doesn't work on your machine, you might have to do some Googling or some chat GPTing to figure it out, but it's not that bad. Anyhow, this is the first command that we enter, and this is all terminal related stuff. So here I am using the terminal that's integrated with Cursor, and this is the first command that we'll enter. Here you can put a comment, and I'll say my key for GitHub. Usually what you'll see here is people will put their email. Anyways, this is just a comment. I think it's optional. Anyhow, I'll click enter. This is going to generate a quote unquote password or SSH key that's going to get stored on your computer. And this is where by default it's going to get stored too. If you want to store it somewhere else, you just have to write the path to where you want it to be stored here. But I'll just go with the defaults. And I did not provide a password, so this one is also empty. And if you see something like this, then you did everything correct. The next thing that we do is run the quote unquote SSH agent. And this is a way of integrating this SSH key or password that we just created into our OS so that every time we try to connect with GitHub, our OS will pick up this SSH key and do all the authentication stuff in the background so we don't have to worry about it. And next up, we have to add a little configuration to the SSH setup on our machine. SSH, by the way, is a pretty standard protocol. All of this SSH tooling predates GitHub. Let me delete this. And then here is the entry that we're going to add. So whenever we try to make a SSH connection to GitHub, use the SSH key that we just created. And it says here, if you chose not to add a passphrase, you should omit the use keychain line. Okay. So it says we can omit this, and let's save that. And we have to enter this, and I don't think we need this. Yeah. So if you see something that says identity added, that means everything is looking good. And the final step of this connecting or authenticating with GitHub process is this. And what we have to do is copy the public key of the SSH key that we just created. So an SSH key has two parts. It has a public and a private component. And the way I look at this is the public key is like the ID of you on a particular system or within a particular authentication protocol. And the way that you prove that you are that ID is by providing the password that's associated with that ID. Excuse me if that's a little bit abstract, but to give you another analogy, it's like your email and password when you log into systems, right? You provide your email, that's like your ID on the system. And the way that you prove you are that ID or that identity is by providing the password. Anyhow, this command will copy the public key of the SSH key that we just created. And if we come over to GitHub, so if we come into GitHub proper, and we do have to have an account. If we come into our settings, and then come over to this SSH and GPG keys section, I'll create a new SSH key and call this one vibe coding. Then I'll paste in the public key that we copied. Add that. And yeah, I have to do a multi-factor Humblaga thing. Let me take care of this and pause the video. You can now see we have an SSH key registered. So now we are connected or authenticated with GitHub. And what we're going to do is create a new repository, which, long story short, is a place where we can store snapshots. And I'm going to call this repository vibe coding website. I'll make this public for now to keep this simple, but you can make this repository private, meaning that you'll whitelist whoever has access to it. And you can leave all this default, create a repository, And because we already have some snapshots on our machine, this is the next sequence of commands that we need to run. If you were starting from scratch with no repository or snapshots on our local, then we would run these. If you harken back, you'll recognize some of these instructions. Anyhow, these are the ones that we need. This first command creates what's called a remote on our local repository. So we're storing snapshots of our application on our machine, and we can have multiple remotes where we can store backups or copies of these local snapshots. And we can call the remote whatever we want. Here, by default, it's called origin, but we could have called this best remote ever, whatever we want, right? So anyhow, let's just stick with the defaults. The next command is this one, which creates what's called a branch. If we look at our Git log, which is the history of the snapshots that we've taken, each snapshot gets this really long ID that's hard to remember. So what we can do is create an alias for one of these IDs, and that alias is called a branch. So you can see here, the last snapshot or commit that we've taken is also called main. Anyhow, let's now run this. And if this works, we should see a copy of all of our code here when we refresh. Fingers crossed this works the first time. And we got lucky. So if we come here and refresh, you can now see we have a copy of all of our code. Now let's show you a little trick for how you can deploy this Next.js web application that's sitting in this GitHub repository. Next.js is a framework that was created and is currently maintained by a company called Vercel. And Vercel has a very easy to use integration with GitHub that allows us to very easily deploy standard Next.js applications. So in order to use this trick, you're going to need to create an account on vercel.com, which I've already done. And what I can do is import a repo from some Git provider. And I have to add the repository that we just created. And I like to give minimal permissions when I'm integrating platforms with each other on principle. So let's pick that exact repo that we just created and give Vercel the ability to read all of the code inside of it. And now we can import this code into Vercel. And let's leave all of this default and deploy our application. Hopefully this doesn't take too long. Let's see how it goes. It looks like it's working. So here we have our website running on a server hosted by Vercel. The last thing that we're going to do is map this deployment of our application to a custom domain, because when you're making a website, you want to give people a nice branded domain name. So you can use that to get business and whatnot, right? And build your name. So let's set that up, and that's going to be it for this video. Here we are in the project on Vercel for the Next.js web application that we've been developing. And if we come over to the settings, there's a tab called domains, and we can add a domain here. And the one that we're going to go with is cmdlabs.io. Let's add that and click save. And we now have to configure our DNS. So when you're purchasing a custom domain, you have to go to a registrar. And there are many registrars out there. For example, GoDaddy. There's another one called Namecheap. The one that I use to acquire cmdlabs.io is called Route 53. It's owned by Amazon. Here are all of the settings that I've currently configured for this domain name. And this is the one that we need to update, this A record, right? So the name has to be @ and the value has to be this. And then let's save that A record, right? And we also have to add a CNAME record, Let's create a record. This is going to be a CNAME record. The name will be www as indicated here. And the value will be cname.vercel-dns.com. And let's create that. I'll indicate that I've added this. It says there's an issue. Let me try removing this @ symbol. Wondering if that's the issue. Did that work? Yes. So here you can see now when I visit cmdlabs.io, it redirects to www.cmdlabs.io and it loads the web application that's being hosted in Vercel. Welcome to vibe coding. Definitely aspects of what we are showing here represent what software is going to look like. The days of having to tell or ask or have humans code every line of an application, I think the reality is those days are over. So plan accordingly.